H. Moreno, Silver Samurai Productions. H. Moreno, Silver Samurai Productions. H. Moreno, Silver Samurai Productions. H. Moreno, Silver Samurai Productions.
何？お前はもう死んでいる。何？お前はもう死んでいる。
Asian American Silver Samurai Productions.
何お前はもう死んでいる。何お前はもう死んでいる。
Asian American Silver Samurai Productions. Asian American Silver Samurai Productions. Asian American Silver Samurai Productions.
Hi everyone, good afternoon. My name is Vignesh Kobinathan. I'm a programmer here with the Asian Film Archive, and I'd like to welcome you to today's panel session. It's called Singapore Imagined. So this is a program that's part of a larger program called Constellating Histories, which is primarily a screening program that's been running from the start of this year, and it will be going on until the middle of March. So this is a guest curated program that is focused on Asian American filmmaking and representation from sort of its early beginnings all the way to contemporary times. And it's been guest curated by Abby Sun and Keisha Knight, who are up there, our guest curators, who are joining us from the West Coast in the US. I'll be sort of introducing our guests shortly, but I just wanted to give a bit of a context on, I guess, why we're here and what this program is about. I'm sure the curators will be able to say a bit more about their program. But this program is it's part of it's how, well, when Asian Film Archive, our remit usually is to kind of give you the breadth of Asian filmmaking and Asian cinema. And sometimes a lot of these categories are quite arbitrary, and we want to try to open up new spaces of inquiry. And within that, diaspora filmmaking is something that we are very interested in, because these ideas of overlapping histories and identities play out in very fascinating and intriguing ways when we're talking about creative expression. So that's kind of where our interest in Asian American filmmaking came from, and also the almost this new era of Asian American filmmaking with all these contemporary mainstream titles that have been coming out. We wanted to provide a sort of historical context where this tradition or legacy comes from, but at the same time, what are some corners of this history that are lesser known, which is where Abby and Keisha have given us this really interesting journey of where Asian American filmmaking it kind of emerges from. And within that, we also wanted to contextualize it back to Singapore. I think we have some film academics and historians here in the audience tonight, and Singapore has always been used as a location and as a locale since even the beginning of cinema. But there's almost this new interest in Singapore as a space, and Singapore as both a cultural space and a media space has been constantly reimagined and imagined, which is where the title of this program comes from. And so we wanted to speak to that, which is where we've assembled with us a very diverse group of individuals who come in with their own unique vantage points. So that's a sort of a rough preamble of why we are here today. So I'm just going to proceed to shortly introduce all our guests. So starting with our guests on screen, we have Abby Sun, who's one of our guest curators, and she's also the director of artist programs at the International Documentary Association. We have Keisha Knight, our other guest curator, and she's the director of funds at the International Documentary Association, and also creative director of Sentient Art Film, which is a creative distribution initiative. We have Tan Keng Hua, actor producer. We have Leon Chio, writer director. Preeti Nair, also known as Preeti Please, content creator and social media personality. And right at the end, we have Freddie Yeo, Chief Operating Officer of Infinite Studios. Yeah, so thank you all for being here. Thank you. Yeah. I'd like to welcome our guests here, but I'd also like to welcome those who are joining us through the live stream on Facebook and YouTube from wherever you are in the world. So today's session, how it's going to proceed is that we'll be just talking amongst ourselves for roughly about 45 minutes or so, and then we'll open the floor to questions both from audiences here and from anyone who's joining us from primarily on YouTube and Facebook. And how we're also going to be taking questions from those on who are joining us on stream. So if you can start thinking of your questions now, you can as the session proceeds, you can already type them onto the comment section, and my colleagues here will collate them and pass them to me. So that's kind of how this is gonna go. So my first question is to our guest curators up there. Since this session is kind of taking on from the program itself, I thought that would be a good place to start. So so this is for both Abby and Keisha. In the Constellating Histories program that you've guest curated for us, we can trace both the canonical trajectories as well as the non-canonical developments and interventions in what is understood of Asian American filmmaking. From your perspective, what is the Asian American cinematic imagery, and what are your thoughts on its current developments and expansion via countries such as Singapore? So Abby and Keisha, either of you can take it on.
Yeah, thank you, Vic, for the introduction and also for inviting us to be a part of this. Can everyone hear me? Okay,
yes.
Okay, perfect. We did only a very brief tech check ahead of time. That's a huge question. I think for us, the way that we imagine this, because this was what is a survey of Asian American filmmaking was what we were presented with when we were approached by Vic to do this program. And it's a really difficult question to answer because there are multiple trajectories throughout history. And I imagine that this is the same way that you imagine Singapore being depicted on screen. There are kind of officialized or canonized depictions, the ones that are in studio films or in films that are depicted or in film studies classes that are canonized in other ways on, for instance, polls that are released and academic pieces that are released. And for us, we wanted to trace in the quote unquote officialized or more traditional trajectories, moments of resistance or interesting films that didn't necessarily show like for instance, in the first week, we have some anime long films that were in this series, but we chose the ones that we thought that showed the slippages between moments, things that were a little bit not expected. For instance, a film that is not with the kind of lilting, singing, ching chong Chinese accents that we imagine Hollywood studio films to be. And this continues throughout the 70s and 80s when Jackie Chan and other East Asian stars cross over into Hollywood studios. But the bulk of our program and what we're interested in, or at least what I'm interested in, are the messy anti-histories of Asian American cinema, where Asian American filmmakers start to push back against these stereotypes and the messy questions of representation, and also expected ways of producing, financing, and releasing their films. So that's where a lot of the documentaries and independent films come from. There is an interesting question, I would say, when it comes, and this directly ties into what I understand to be a lot of the debates around Crazy Rich Asians and other Hollywood studio and recent films that have proclaimed Asian American representation. But even within Asian America, this idea that these Hollywood studio films and that that box office success is a marker and a driver of how filmmakers are represented, it's still contested within Asian American filmmaking, within independent cinema, within all of the associations and institutions that we operate within. So we really wanted to represent that. There's a short program coming up about featuring female Hawaiian filmmakers, for instance, that's guest curated by Taylor Chang, who is a film curator who is from Honolulu, Hawaii. And those types of things, to me, like, we're really trying to push forward this idea that there is no monolith, that there has been struggle, even within, I think for me, I'm like personally very skeptical of representation as the marker and value of authenticity within filmmaking, and that's the only value. It's this idea that that's the only value that filmmaking or Asian American filmmaking should have. But we're interested not only on a representational level, but in terms of formal and also kind of industrial qualities. How are filmmakers releasing their films? How are they funding their films? That's why so many of the program notes actually reflect how films were funded and released as well, because that's just as important to me as kind of what it is that we see within the frame of the screen. Keisha, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I got a little something. Like, same, but a little bit like different sprinkle. I would also say that's something that Abby and I are always thinking through. And in addition to that kind of formal innovation, which is something we're always looking for at like the seed of what we're curating, there's this history in the United States of Asian Americans as the model minority. And that is something that we're always trying to think about and curate against. And so a lot of the films that we're drawn to are films about marginalized communities, undocumented Asian American communities, mixed communities, all of that. And like, for me, the interesting question is really about, how does that relate to Singapore? Like, how does that kind of like more marginal, representation actually filter through the diaspora? Because for me, those are the stories that are really kind of like about the messiness and the complicatedness and kind of like the way we're negotiating these different types of like existences that are maybe not within, as you were saying, Abby, like the frame of what the mainstream is. So that's always something that's on our minds, and was a little bit, as Vic was pushing us to kind of do something that was a little bit more comprehensive, that was something that was always in tension, like with this program, as we were kind of choosing the larger titles, like what can always keep pointing back to that. That's something we were always thinking about.
Thanks, Keisha. Yeah, that actually reminds me. Sorry, I promise I will stop speaking. But one thing that I think is a little bit unresolved in our program, and this maybe reflects the funding structure that even independent Asian American filmmakers are facing in the US, is for a long time, I would argue even now, it's difficult to get funding for Asian American stories. So a lot of Asian American filmmakers have actually gone back to quote unquote ancestral homeland and made more ethnographic or docufiction or these hybrid cinemas that are from, yes, American filmmakers, but representing what might be an imagined homeland, or making stories that are quote unquote authentic, hybrid films in their families' homelands, but which for these filmmakers, they've never actually lived in anything like that. So this also directly ties back to Crazy Rich Asians. It's not something that I fault filmmakers for, because they have to get funding and recognition where they can, but it does lead to this question of the American colonialist eye on, film production from Asia, because oftentimes these films have been presented within the Western or American Film Festival context as authentic voices, but they're made by US-based filmmakers.
Thank you. Thanks, Abby and Keisha, for that preamble. I think it really helps to kind of place into context the topics that we might be delving into today. And I think I just want to pick up on two threads that were brought up by Abby and Keisha. And I think that really relates quite well to the experiences that are shared amongst our panelists here today. I think on one end, we have a sort of a larger national slash international, a national slash production related objectives or aims on how Singapore or a nation like Singapore ought to be represented on a global scale. And I think from a micro point of view, there's also ideas about individual aspirations, individual desires, notions of representation. And I think these are topics that we will come back to revisit in several different ways today. And I think I want to start off with from an industry perspective. So Freddie, I just want to throw the floor to you. As someone who's involved with our very own, I guess, studio here in Singapore with Infinite Studios, I just wanted to ask, based on your experience with co-producing shows such as Westworld, Crazy Rich Asians, what are your thoughts about how Singapore is being represented in this kind of cross-national platforms? Yeah.
First and foremost, thank you very much, EFA, for inviting. I got a bit scared when I kind of read the summary and basically what the objective was. It's reminded me back in my film school days, I had to study cultural films and things. I'm like, oh gosh, man, I'm now like getting my hands dirty in actual production. I don't even think about that kind of stuff anymore. But it is very important, I think, in the context of really what has happened over the last few years. I must say that COVID actually was a real dampener for us, because there was a trajectory since 2014 where we did Agent 47, and after the Equals, which was really Scott's film, then Crazy Rich Asians, and then after Westworld. And even after Westworld, there was stuff that was going to come on already. And it's about momentum for us. If we are seen on screen, people are going to remember, and then people are going to get intrigued. Crazy Rich Asians, for that point of matter, was a huge canvas for us in terms of publicity, and it brought a lot of attention to people's eyes. So, but I'll speak specific to Westworld as just an example, because there's just so many ways to talk about this, but maybe just specifically Westworld. When we were approached, the brief was, we want futuristic, utopia-looking, fantastic looking architecture that represents the future. That was it, right? And we then obviously did what we needed to do, did the kind of a pre-scout and send a lot of images. As filmmakers here, I mean yourselves, I'm sure some of you guys are, please don't send images that you know you're not going to get. Because if the director likes it, he wants it, and why did you send me that in the first place? Simple as that, right? So what was really interesting was that when Jonah Nolan came down, it was his first time in Singapore, and he only knew Singapore for its kind of, research, reputation, and things like that as well. Is it difficult to shoot here? Oh, we've got all that. Michael Fay came up, right? Caning. Oh my goodness. Chewing gum, for those who are younger than you, you weren't even born yet when it happened. So, we have that draconian kind of a feel, capital punishment, everything else, right? That sticks in the mind of people. And these are the kinds of things that inspires people to write their narrative. But because this is a drama, and he was already thinking of future world, if he follows Westworld, he was introducing future world, and he wanted to know where the future world is going to be. And I was just explaining to the panel earlier, because this is stuff that you will not ever find out or read, unless somebody like me breaks the secrecy or whatever it is, which I don't think it's any security concerns. But when he came down that 1 week, I made sure I fed him our local delights, Peranakan food, chicken rice, everything else. And I tell you, that was all part of that experience and that sensory kind of a thing that he had. From what he knew to just being in Singapore, looking and feeling at everything, at the dynamics of what we are about as a culture. And culture includes food and locations and everything else. He extended the shoot, which was initially meant to be 3 days, to 10 days, and wrote Singapore into Westworld. You can't pay anyone to do that. The creative guys at that level needs to be inspired about what they see and what they feel. So in that really just a short notion, I think, just back to your question again, going on, I'm not going off point, they landed on Singapore shores because of Singapore in terms of what we are being reported as a country, progressive, futuristic, and things like that, But the underbelly of Singapore, is when they come and we take them to all the different aspects of things that would serve to inspire them. And at that stage where they are at a very technical pre-production, they still have time to write narratives in, right? Based on their own experience of what they actually felt, So I think Crazy Rich Asians is completely different because that was really based on a book to a certain degree, But kudos to John Chu and Keng Hua will know this, I think he was very adamant about representing Singapore in his cultural aspects like Newton Circus, make sure that the satay guy is doing the right thing, And he wasn't going to try and be too clever about it from a visual perspective, but rather, no, I need it to be represented. Of course, we tried to say, look, the security guard with the Raffles guy is not always the typical, stereotypical Indian, guy with the turban, right? but but obviously there are certain aspects of that, that kind of had to follow through the book and things like that. So I think Singapore, from what we've been kind of approached by the West in terms of looking at Singapore as a location first and foremost, I think we cannot get away. We cannot get away from the fact that we have this beautiful nature blending kind of with our cosmopolitan design setup and things like that, which completely intrigues them, because they've just, maybe we live in Singapore and maybe we take all these things for granted, but what they see is almost in their minds, this is what their vision, their future is actually going to be. It's quite mind-boggling when you hear that from people like that, who have not been to Singapore, and it's always that one-sided perspective in a sense, because we live here, so we don't think anything of it to a certain degree sometimes, but obviously it's always about that kind of pristine, polished kind of a look and things like that kind of draws from a visual standpoint. But when it comes down to the narrative, I think it needs to work for whatever purpose. Agent 47 was a film that started in Germany. The action moved from Germany to Singapore. So it was just written in that formal manner, and that was that, right? But I think in terms of the representation, particularly from the local side of things, I also tend to think that it is not, the optics shouldn't also just be about films in Singapore, but I think we are starting to become more what we call a region. And I think the focus has to be of a Southeast Asian nature, as opposed to just purely Singapore. But I'll leave it as that, so that we can let the other panelists also.
Thanks, Freddie. Yeah, that's really helpful. I also want to pick up on what Keisha brought up about. I believe it was either Abby or Keisha brought up the word slippages, and that kind of stuck with me. So I want to talk a bit about this idea of slippages and also fault lines. There are, of course, like what Freddie has illustrated for us, this broader idea of the aspirations of what Singapore either is trying to represent or what is being kind of placed onto Singapore as this idea of futuristic nation, about its potentials, in a very sci-fi sort of way. But they're also, but I'm also thinking about cultural power, who gets to make these decisions, and also about what kind of communities and experiences don't get to be pushed forward into a more prominent sense. I mean, the same year that Crazy Rich Asians came out was also the year that that A Land Imagined came out, right? Showing a very different side of Singapore. And just just a few years before that, there was A Yellow Bird, which of course was representing a minority experience that was almost never even seen, even on local filmmaking. I think at this point, I want to open the floor to Preeti. So Preeti, I mean, as a prominent social media personality, you use your platform not just to entertain, but you also raise awareness on social issues that may not otherwise receive much attention amongst wider public. Based on what has been shared just now, I'm just wondering, what is your opinion on this idea of the Singapore imaginary? And if you could also comment on this cross-media, representations between Singapore and the US, and yeah, what are your thoughts on this image that's being constructed and presented as someone who yourself is a content creator who's presenting an image of yourself? Oops. Your mic.
Got it. Thank you. Sorry, I can't even on a mic and I'm a content creator. Anyways, yeah, so I think in a lot of my content, I definitely do a lot of social commentary. So it's a lot of satire just to like kind of call out all the things that I think are happening in Singapore and we need to have more conversations about. So that's how it started. And it was just a lot of parodies, a lot of just talking about everyday life and all the stuff that I just want to start conversations about, or at least continue the conversation, expand the conversations about. So I think for me, like, I mean, personally, I don't look at film, or I don't watch film to like I guess I don't look for representation when I watch a film. I don't watch a film and I don't expect to see someone that looks like me or sounds like me. But that is also because I'm used to that. And that is how like I'm used to not seeing people that look like me and sound like me in like even just local media, unless it's a it's a token Indian, a token minority. And I've talked about this a lot in my content and made a lot of jokes about it. But of course, I mean, in the recent years, I mean that has been changing a lot, and a lot of people have been like making sure that like, okay, whatever content that they want to put out or produce, they're trying to make it as inclusive as possible, which is really important, and the point of like why I even make the content that I make. But of course, when I think about like Asian American like media or anything like that, I also feel the South Asian part of it gets forgotten quite a lot. And I mean, when I started creating content, a lot of like my friends like in Singapore who are even older than me, they told me things like, I wish I had a pretty please growing up. And hearing that, I was like, wow, actually, I wish I had a pretty please growing up, which is such a weird thing to say. But I mean, all they're trying to say is that they're looking for that representation. They're just looking for someone they can relate to in that sense. And for me, when I watch like Asian American media, and I mean, of course, Mindy Kaling, Lily Singh, I look at women like that, and I'm like, oh, that's great. Like, I wanna be able to do all the things they get to do, and it's so exciting. Like, growing up and watching their stuff, and now I feel like the conversation is at a point where it's not just about the representation, but it's also about are we accurately represented? And people are starting to also critically like be very critical about even Mindy Kaling content. People are like, oh, how come it's not the dark-skinned Indian people that are getting the roles or featured, and people are being a bit more critical about that. So I think we're at a point where yeah, personally, I don't look at film and I don't expect to see someone like me and sound like me. So when a film like Crazy Rich Asians came out, if I can be extremely brutally honest, I did not watch it, and I don't intend to. And it's not because like, I mean, for me, it's like it's just not something that I personally would go out of my way to watch. So I never did, but of course I heard a lot of like the commentary on it. I heard a lot of people feeling like, oh, like the minorities in Singapore were not accurately represented. That was something I heard. And when I saw like the depictions of it, when I saw how the roles were, I was also like, oh, okay, like doesn't seem accurate too, but like I didn't really comment much because I didn't watch the film. So I feel like, of course, I should watch it before I say something about it. But I also feel like it was, as much as we think that, as much as a lot of people think that that's not really an accurate representation of Singapore, I think it is. I think it is pretty accurate. And I think how pristine Singapore looks and how like everything looks so great on the surface, I think that is Singapore as a whole. And nobody, like, not a lot of mainstream media at least talks about the underbelly of Singapore, talks about like, I mean, just in the recent few years when COVID hit, like migrant workers were stashed away in dormitories. And you would need to look at like independent creators, like putting out documentaries, interviews, and stuff like that to even get proper coverage on the actual on-ground situation and even understand what's happening in Singapore. And you cannot look to like, like film completely, because that would take a while also for something like that to be approved in Singapore, for something like that to be screened in Singapore. So it's not a medium that I completely would like look at. And I would look at social media, of course, because when COVID hit, my friends and I, we were making content about like, okay, what's happening in the dorms? Like what are they being fed? Like what are they allowed to do? Why are they just stashed away? Which was so honestly really disgusting. So we made videos like that. We started fundraisers, and I am so grateful for social media because we get to do all these things like from the comfort of my own room. My friends and I raised $350,000 for two migrant worker organizations in Singapore, just during the circuit breaker in my bedroom. So that is pretty crazy to me. And yeah, I think when I think about representation in Singapore, like when only when those voices are heard and when those voices are represented, then I would feel like, okay, like there is proper representation in Singapore. So currently, I still think it is something that the media industry as a whole like lacks. But of course, if we want to just compare it to a couple of years back, a lot has changed just because of social media and the pandemic as a whole, and the amount of like content that is now just like completely online, because there's so many content creators that came up and voices that came up in the last few years.
Thanks, Preeti. Yeah, I think what you're speaking about really speaks to this idea that we no longer have this monolithic power of or whether it's got to do with publicity or where we get our news and so on. But I guess there's a lot more way to go with that. Yeah, thank you. I think Crazy Rich Asians has come up quite a few times. So I'll be remiss if I didn't get Keng to comment a bit about your experience being involved with the film and how that's been for you since your journey through that film and then up to now.
It's very funny, but I've spent the last 7 years of my life mostly in North America. And the reason for that is because of Crazy Rich Asians. After Crazy Rich Asians, I was presented with opportunities for representation in North America. I explored it and I took it up, and it's been very good for me. The funny thing about representation, and I have heard a lot of that word being used in North America in the last 7 years, is that for me, and I'd like to qualify that I am not a social commentator, neither am I a content creator, neither am I a film historian. I'm not a film academic. In fact, I did not even study acting. Okay, I got Bachelor of Science. So I just want to qualify that whatever I say is just from Keng herself, okay? I've heard a lot of this word representation being used in the last 7 years when I'm working in and living in North America. And I have to say, ladies and gentlemen, that as an observer, which ultimately is what I am, I've always found it very strange that this word is being used by this industry, which is actually an artifice. Television, film, movies, isn't, there's lights and sound, and there's a soundtrack, and there's a story, and all these people like me who are playing characters, we're not the real characters. I mean, I'm an actor. In Crazy Rich Asians, I didn't represent Singaporeans. I played an Asian American migrant mom. And I didn't say yes to Crazy Rich Asians to represent Singapore. I said yes to Crazy Rich Asians, just like I said yes to many theatre productions, just like how I said yes to this panel, because it spoke to me. It was work that I liked, that gave me joy, that has given me a wonderful living, just like all of you. And so that's my first comment about what I think about representation, because how many people, I would like to answer that question with questions actually, which is, why is this word representation suddenly such a hot word in the film industry in the last, maybe 8-10 years? Why? I have some answers, but I think it might be more useful for all of us to actually listen to questions. How do we define representation? And what is authenticity? And is representation a word and an issue that is actually necessary for good acting, for good movies, for good storytelling, for good soundtrack? Is it or is it not? And yeah, it's an interesting playground. I have played a dog several times, actually. I've also played a horse. Do I represent dogs and horses? I have never followed Orthodox religion, does that mean that I cannot play a person who is deeply religious? Do I need to see a 60-year-old, 45 kg Singaporean Chinese woman on screen to be touched by a story and an emotion and a thought that is going to stick with me and inspire me and do what art does, which is to touch people and to make us reflect on our lives? For me, and I'll only answer as King, I don't need to see a 60-year-old Singaporean Chinese woman story to make me feel touched. I can see a story about a dog or a horse, and I would still sometimes feel like my heart is being represented. It's just how well my heart is being represented that I often think about. That's my comment.
Thank you, King. Yeah. I mean, if I may just quickly kind of respond to that.
Please.
I think the perspective you've shared is, obviously from a very personal standpoint. I just want to say that I think the reason why maybe perhaps the reason why ideas of representation have taken up more prominence in recent years is that I think there's an awareness that cultural power has been entrenched within certain groups of people for a very long time, and that several pockets of communities have not been part of this conversation and yet are being spoken for. And I think different communities are now being empowered to share that power and to represent themselves in the way that they would like to be represented. So I think that's broadly why I think conversations about representation are taking the fall, as it were. Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think the privilege of observance at close quarters is something that has been extremely educational for me. During the Crazy Rich Asians, sort of press sessions, many times I was asked, what do I think about Asian American representation? And I will always be very honest, and I'll always say, I'm not Asian American. I do not know. I need time. I'm learning from my co-actors. I have learned a lot. It is hard for me to comment on representation when, in my real experience, I guess in Singapore, I've always felt empowered, heard. Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks, King.
Vignesh, sorry,
Yes.
let me just add on, if you don't mind. As an industry, we celebrated. We celebrated Keng Hua. We celebrated Henry, Selena, because they all got noticed and then got opportunities in the West. I think that was so important for us. It wasn't so much about representing Singaporeans, but the fact that a film like that opened up huge opportunities that, I mean, Keng Hua, you know what? People were saying when they talked about Singapore in the West was, we only knew Chin Han. And I think a lot of people don't even know Chin Han was Singaporean anyway. But why? They were saying, and this is again industry, huh? So between yourself and Michelle Yeoh, where were you all these years? Where were you all these years? We celebrated that because we needed a film with that platform to be able to actually launch potentially the potential and the careers for so many of the talents. I just wanted to add that because I think it's so important that, it's not about the Singaporeanness or we hold the national flag. No, it is about the opportunity as an actor, right? That you are able to get
Absolutely.
that.
And I also have to admit that the reason why I've been able to act and have worked in North America for the last 7 years, just one after another, right? Is because this dialogue about representation has given birth to so many projects which need actors that look like me. I do think that representation cannot be something that is proactively made and then as a goal to reach towards. I do think that very strong representation that sits well with people. Let's just talk about how Paris is being seen as a city. I don't think somebody long time ago looked upon Paris and thought, oh, let's make this a romantic city. It became a romantic city. How did it become a romantic city? I'm not sure. I'm very excited to see now that, Singapore does have a lot of these conversations and we are all a part of this now. How is Singapore going to be seen in about 10 years? Currently, when I'm away, many people have heard of the word Singapore, but do they really know who we are, what we are? I still have people who come up to me and ask me why I speak such good English. So there's still some work to be done.
Yes, yeah, certainly. Thanks, King, and thanks, Freddie. I just want to, move on to Leon. Like King, I suppose you also work between the US and Singapore, but in the capacity as a writer-director. Your short film, Sin SFO, speaks directly to these notions of, dual identities, cultural, national identities. I'm wondering if you can talk a bit about your position, of being based in the US, as a Singaporean filmmaker. And I think King spoke about how, notions of, for her personally, notions of representation don't, it doesn't quite figure into how she views her work and her career. I'm wondering, what is your perspective on that?
I think I understand where King is coming from, but then it's quite different from where I'm standing, because I think one interesting thing I've noticed, ever since I moved there, I would say like in 2015, is that I've suddenly become a minority, which is also not really the case in the West Coast, but in general, I've become a minority, and then do I get affected by some of these identity politics that happens? And then when you invited me to this panel, I asked myself, so how long do you have to be in the US to be considered Asian American? Do you need to have a green card or a citizenship before you even start that? And I think that's a question that I will always keep asking. Being an immigrant, a filmmaker, and but I think one difference is that because I am first of all Chinese and then and then born in Singapore in Asia, I don't have a lot of some of those like representational hangups that some Asian Americans feel in general, in terms of like being on screen and all that kind of stuff. But I do feel the effects of that, and then I do think it's actually really hard to be diverse. I think representation is a choice right from the beginning of the creative process for me, where and especially for the writer or the director or the producer, that's a mandate. That's like, okay, we have to have a diversity of crew and cast, for example, or like, I want to tell a story with some diversity if it makes sense within the context of the story. It is very hard in Singapore to have, a crew that is like majority non-Chinese, and so that's something that I always battle with as well. And funnily enough, when I make films in the US, it's like, depending on the story, sometimes it's like, oh, you just end up having more Asians just because I'm the boss, for example. But that's also then a good thing over there, because usually it'll be like, perhaps like a majority white or et cetera, et cetera. So I think if one is the majority race, it is a challenge and it's a choice to really say like, okay, let's make the extra effort to find, you know, to have a diverse cast, um, to find a DP who's not Chinese, for example, a cinematographer who's not Chinese or female, all that kind of thing. Like it's very easy to just go with what you know, but it's actually really, really hard to be diverse. Yeah.
Thank you. At this point, I'd like to open the floor to questions. I also want to remind those who are joining us on Facebook and YouTube that you can type your questions onto the comment section, and we can see them here. So if you have any questions here in the audience, just raise your hand, and my colleague will come and pass you a mic. Any questions on the floor at this point? No? Maybe people are still a bit shy. Okay, maybe we'll come back. We'll come back in a bit. Yeah. Yes, give me a second. Okay, I think I want to just throw the questions back to Abby and Keisha. Yeah, I just wanted to maybe ask if you have any responses to what has been shared earlier. I think naturally the questions went into ideas of representation, and I'm wondering if you could maybe just comment a bit about what has been shared from the Singaporean perspective.
Thanks, Vic. I spoke first last time. Keisha, do you want to go first this time?
Yeah, I guess I could. I mean, there's a lot that's coming up in my head right now. There seems to be definitely like a tension between kind of industrial concerns and I mean, I think questions of representation, which I will say are not new, right, have been around at least since the mid-90s. So I just want to like put that out there, like definitely not new concerns. They're political questions, right? Like they're questions of visibility and they're questions of taking up space. And I think that that's distinct from like personal, maybe like more kind of like career oriented questions, and then also like maybe industrial questions of like, where's my audience, who fits, what will sell, this and this and that and that. And I think for Abby and I both, film is always political and it's always making an intervention in that space. And films that aren't, I mean, even films that don't seem like we've been talking about Crazy Rich Asians a lot, which may seem like not a political film, for example, but is absolutely a political film, right? It's a sanitized, like a version, actually, as someone said, like, yeah, like this is Singapore. I mean, I, as a Black woman who lived in Southeast Asia for 5 years, like been to Singapore a bunch of times, very much like Crazy Rich Asians does reflect a certain experience of a certain type of Singapore. But I think that like the deeper question here is like, I mean, at least for us in terms of this kind of like international curation, is like, what are the currents that are like, what are the potentialities that are kind of like connecting us, like what are the things that we can kind of like, I mean, if we are thinking about changing the world or like kind of like altering different kinds of like modes of, thinking, like what are the ways that representation and like our intentionality around it, even though, as Leon said, like, yeah, it's hard. It's even hard in the United States, right? Like, and there's a lot of work around like intentionally like doing the work. And like, I'm a funder, so funding people to do the work, to like create different spaces for different voices, because actually who is at the table does actually matter. And then how does that relate to the kind of international context? That's something we were trying to think through with this program. Like what would be useful to open up and try to like create dialogue across. So I don't know, Abby, if you have, I'm ranting a little bit, but if you have anything to add to that.
Yeah, thanks, Keisha. I kind of, I don't know. I also don't want to seem overly academic or anything like that, but there were some kind of useful phrases or ideas or terminology that I was thinking of when listening to everyone on stage talk. And one is kind of trying to disassociate this idea of representation from like maybe what is actually on screen and how often or how featured a place is, because Asia does, for instance, occur in a lot of Hollywood films, in Fast and Furious films and Pacific Rim and, you know, all of these Marvel movies and all of that, which have locations, whether it's South Korea, Busan, and all of these places, but it's never specific. It's a form of what we would term techno-Orientalism, using Asian spaces without Asian people or authentic Asian experiences, whatever authenticity might mean. And I feel like a lot of what's kind of missing here, so I'm Han Chinese myself, is also just the predominance of Han Chinese people in Hollywood or in kind of taking up the space of what we consider Asian or Pan-Asianness. And I see all of those kind of tensions reflected in what has been talked about thus far from the Singaporean context. And part of what I think about is, well, I will say in America, at least, if this makes anyone in the audience feel better when it comes to Crazy Rich Asians, for instance, I did not actually get the sense that anybody thought that Crazy Rich Asians was actually a good depiction of Singapore, or an accurate depiction of Singapore. It was received as just kind of an extension of Asian America. And I think it's true, it could have been any city, could have been Hong Kong, could have been Shanghai, could have been Seoul, wherever, you know, people came from. And what is at least received in film circles as being quote unquote authentic Singapore is kind of an offshoot of world cinema in the World Film Festival circuit. So we would be talking about filmmakers like Tan Ping Ping and Eric Koo and all of that, at least in cinephile film circles. So there's kind of also, I think, a disconnect between what are, I mean, the stakes are real. I guess I'm not trying to like dismiss like representation and people's ideas of what is real and what is not, but Asia is such kind of an amorphous space for the American imaginary that it's still just jumbled all together, is my personal impression of it all.
Thank you. Thanks, Abby and Keisha. Yes, we have a question over there.
Hi, I'm Ben. This is not really a question, but like a bunch of ideas. And I guess my first question to everybody is like, what line are we drawing here? Because when I read the description for the talk, it's like Asian American and then Singapore imaginary, and no link. To me, there's no link between that. And then Abby talks about how Crazy Rich Asians is seen as generic Asian country. So then what are we talking about when we try and draw this line between an Asian American experience and a Singaporean representation or imaginary on screen? And this is kind of like a question to ask how all of you respond to that, because Freddie talks about success. And success in Singapore in terms of media is to go out of Singapore, right? To represent us as a career, but never to represent us as a people or an experience, right? For Keng Hua, you go overseas, you take on roles. I don't know if you've ever gotten an experience of a role that is a Singaporean person, right? And for Crazy Rich Asians, you're not even playing a Singaporean. But Leon, when you go overseas, are you making stories about Singaporeans? Is that even a conception of a Singaporean American? Because that already can splinter out into Chinese American, Malay American, Indian American. There's so many splinters and complications when you try and draw a line between Singapore and Asian American experiences, right? And then when we put Westwall on screen, we put Singapore on screen for Westwall for whatever, is that even Singapore on screen, or is that just using Singapore as a studio or a soundstage, right? So what are we doing when we export Singapore to Hollywood or to anywhere else? For the art house filmmakers, you know, they are trying to represent Singapore as itself, but then when we draw a line to America, Singapore disappears, you know, gets eaten up. And then this idea of like the migrant work experience, is that even to us a Singaporean experience? And then to America, is that a Singaporean experience? So what are we trying to export when we draw this line between Singapore and American, and how is that co-opted and dissolved into this idea of a larger Asian experience and American experience. Like I find it very complicated, and I honestly I find the talks kind of concept confounding. So I'm kind of wondering how everyone responds to that and like thinks about that, because I think Singapore disappears a lot when we think about our larger representation on a global stage. Thank you.
I love what you said. Thank you. I mean, I feel that. And also just to pick up on, everything that has been said, I want to once again ask questions, and that is it dangerous to even say these words? Good representation. What is good representation? Bad representation. What is bad representation? Authentic representation. What is authentic representation? There is so much talking, but I just feel sometimes right now, everybody is giving a point of view and we are kind of ahead of ourselves. It's almost as if there is actually something that is happening, but not enough people are observing the natural reality of what is happening right now. Even if there is some representation that is not making people happy, that could be pretty authentic representation. It's just that it may not be something that is making people happy or sitting well with the political, aspirations of today. Thank you. Love what you said.
I'll just add that I don't think there's going to be a one answer, or we are here to even find it one answer, because I think it's all about context and perspective. For me, I come from an industry perspective, obviously, and the context of what we do, and what I deem as success. It boils down to one singular kind of objective: to create a sustainable industry for a lot of the people that are practicing in the industry, to seek out opportunities for these people to work, to improve by working with better people and things like that, right? If I wanted to go into the realms of representation, then we would start talking about critically art house films, perhaps. For me, that's just my way of doing it. I mean, I think Keisha was saying that all films for them are political, which obviously I think, depending on where and what background you come from an industry perspective, I can't afford to be thinking about all films being political. I have to really put things in very specific context in terms of why I do films. But it doesn't mean that if I do commercial films, I don't support independent filmmakers as well. I do, because I think that's a talent, and I will put the resources behind it to try and produce that. But it is to have a different outcome, and I don't think there's a right or wrong as well. I always think that there is always going to be a perspective in terms of the context of what we do and why we do it. That's...
Ben, actually, that's a really great observation, which I also thought of when Vignesh sent me that email invitation. I mean, if you think about it, like, and if I mean, I think I see myself like a quote unquote double immigrant, because my ancestors came to Singapore first, and then now I'm in the US. Whereas the Chinese people, for example, in the US, or the Asian people, they came back from their original homelands, right? So I think that as a filmmaker, I've always battled with that, and I always will, and I enjoy it. And if I can, I will definitely make films about Singaporeans in America all the time, which I did with one film, a little short film, and I think that's really it will be quite interesting to see what happens from there. Yeah.
I'm sorry, we still have Preeti would like to comment. Yes.
Yeah, I personally think for me, like what makes Singapore Singapore is the people. So I definitely think in terms of representation, like it's not, I mean, Singapore is a country that constantly talks about how multiracial and multicultural we are. So to me, if we are going to do that, then of course there's some level of representation that is expected from the minority groups. So, which I think is a fair ask, or like a fair requirement at least. But like, of course, that's not something that we get often, and when we do, like, that's amazing. And I don't expect to see like migrant workers talked about like in movies of like, for sure, but I mean, I guess the people is who we need to like look at for representation. The content, like what's the conversations on ground, you know, like to me that's where like exactly what I said just now, that I don't look to film for representation because I know it is some like pristine or like perfect, like yeah, like Singapore imaginary, you know, like I know that's what I'm gonna get. So yeah, I think that's what I mean when I think representation. I guess the conversations need to be heard, and whatever medium it is gonna, like, these conversations are gonna take place on, like, as long as it's happening, as long as these voices are heard. And like even at Singapore International Film Festival, like a couple of months back, watching the film Baby Queen, and I laughed and I cried so much, and knowing that that was like, I don't know when this is going to be screened again, and I don't know like how people are going to get to watch this, but I really want everyone to watch it. And it was just essentially like a documentary of a drag queen, and it was just so one of the most amazing things I watched in such a long time. And there was so much representation there without even trying, like just the community, and like all the races were represented without it even being forced, or like, oh, we need to make sure that there's a brown person in this. No, it's just the whole community is already like just screaming representation without even trying. Like it wasn't, yeah, it wasn't a script, there wasn't a cast, you know, it wasn't like that. It was a documentary, it was a very real film. So I would love to see more films like that, like screening way more often in Singapore, like in the theaters for people to go watch. But of course I don't know what it takes for a film to be able to get that kind of like a platform. But yeah, you know, stuff like that. So there's definitely representation all around without it even having to be like something that everyone has to like directors, producers have to stress about and be like, we have to include all this. So it's really all around us. And this SGIFF was just like a couple of months back in November. Yeah, so that easily one of the best things I watched. That was like a local film that I watched.
Thank you. I'm wondering if Abby and Keisha want to
Yeah.
respond to what Ben said. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks so much. I just wanted to, I feel very self-conscious jumping in as I can also see myself on screen behind everyone with my face like 10 feet tall or whatever. I guess I'd like to introduce this idea beyond representation, this idea of authorship or maybe proximity to the story. And this is something that we're considering quite a bit in terms of filmmaking and all of that, just because Vic also mentioned at one point earlier in the conversation, the film A Land Imagined by Yosu Hua. And you know, I'm quite interested in the work of 13 Little Pictures and the production company, but this is kind of an interesting case of a film because it was quite accepted on the international film festival circuit as the story of migrant workers in Singapore, but kind of and it's a film that I think is beautifully filmed and really sensitively drawn and has a lot of social realism. It's documentary, of course, and I think a lot of the work of this film production company also follows those lines, and it fits within kind of this independent hybrid notion of documentary, drawing from stories and being done in co-creation or collaboration with the non-professional actors or participants in the films. But there is this idea that, you know, if that is also the representation of Singapore, it's not actually from the perspective of filmmakers who are migrant workers themselves. And that's something that we're also questioning, at least with our work at the International Documentary Association, is like, there's actually many levels when we're thinking about representation that I don't think that representation actually covers. So I think Ben's, you know, kind of like what is actually connecting Asian American filmmaking and perhaps Singapore, what I'm hearing in this conversation today is that it is kind of this surface level, kind of where are people from, what do people look like, but there's all of these divisions of class and of positionality and all of that that are actually a lot more intricate. I'm not saying that filmmakers can't make films about people that are not just themselves or their immediate families or anything like that, but this is something that I find quite missing in the conversation. And another thing is just this idea of, I kind of want to try to draw a link between representation and also the industry, because I think that representation is actually a commercial endeavor. It brings value and money to films right now. And that's why all these conversations are being framed in this way. Night market in Singapore that's in Crazy Rich Asian brings value to the marketing of a film like that. Screenings in the US that were bought by Asian American celebrities were also a concerted marketing plan by an organization named Gold House, which is funded by Asian American millionaires and billionaires to pop up their own interests. And that's something that was introduced a little bit in the independent film scene. I believe it was actually Justin Lin with Better Luck Tomorrow who first used that line of justification. If you come to my film, you'll be supporting Asian American filmmaking. And it was basically instrumentalizing or co-opting grassroots organizing strategies of getting people out to protest in support of a commercial endeavor. Because at that point, the film Better Luck Tomorrow, which had premiered independently at Sundance that year, had been picked up by either Universal Pictures or Paramount Pictures. They didn't produce the film, but it was a studio that released the film. So that's kind of a connection I want to draw historically from the 90s and early 2000s. It's not new, it's quite old.
Thanks, Abby. Keisha, is there anything you'd like to add? Or?
Ben, thank you so much. Like, that was a beautiful observation and question. I guess I'm thinking about like the Singaporean imaginary. And I think one of the things when I was actually really nervous to go to Singapore because I was like, I don't think there's anything here, actually. Like, I think this is like just full of skyscrapers and money, and that's it, you know? And then when I actually got there and was on the ground, it was like a super rich experience. And going to the market, like I stayed in Little India, like just, it was amazing. Like, and I actually loved it. And it took me like a couple of trips to actually get embedded into the place. But so I think that what's interesting, Ben, and what you say about like, does Singapore disappear? It almost seems like the representation of Singapore is meant to disappear in lots of different ways. Like it's meant to kind of like filter into these circuits of capital and just disappear. So in a way, like, I mean, what Priti is saying about, you know, social media being like a more kind of like grounded and active and robust and dynamic representation or manifestation of what Singapore is, I feel like there's like just a tradition of like Singapore disappearing into air, like on screen, you know, like that's kind of at least that was my experience before I actually came to the place.
Thank you. Thanks, Abby and Keisha. I think I just want to just quickly respond to what Ben said. You're right. I mean, it is a confounding premise. One has to admit that. But I think it's also what we wanted to, or I wanted to try to avoid here is to try to do some sort of apples to apples comparison, which is not helpful at all because obviously the cultural trajectories of both nations and both the communities that we're talking about here have very unique starting points and unique developments. I'm very glad that Abby and Keisha brought up the word capital because that's what I wanted to talk about here, because the phantom here really is capital in a sense, you know, where that we often sit within these lines and cultural decisions or cultural policies are made with capital in mind, you know. And I think that's something that's important to talk about. And we talk about Singapore being imagined from a Asian American perspective, but Singapore has been imagined and reimagined several times, you know, within our own country. You know, we obviously have a history and a cultural history that dates back several hundred years, but we've had several interventions within that, you know, political or capital and so on. And so I think it's also important to honor those histories that haven't quite had that through line to now. You know, modern Singapore is a construction. And I think it's true talking about this topic that we're trying to kind of see, we're trying to unpack what is the imaginary that is being constructed here. You know, it's not really about the Asian American imaginary, how it compares to the Singapore imaginary. But the very contradictions that you are talking about is exactly what we're trying to address here. We may not be able to get through all of it, and we may not have gotten through it at all, but I think the attempt is to try to broach it at least a bit. But thank you very much for your question. Yes, of course, yeah. Here you go.
Okay, hi, I'm Sean. Just to add on Ben's ad, I think Singapore, even in the eyes of the Japanese animation creators, they will be featured as a city of destruction after a sci-fi accident happened. In 1998, Sunrise Cowboy Bebop, there's a scene where the female protagonist, who is being said to be a Singaporean called Faye Valentine, went back to Singapore, and Singapore was flooded, because of the accident. And we brought over to United States. Even in the 90s, we see Armageddon. There were one scene I saw that Singapore was destruction. In Universal Pictures, I think 2012, we see the poster in Singapore. Singapore was destruction. So to me, it's like I see it as an entertainment. My North American friends who are into the Japanese animation circuit asked me after he has seen Cowboy Bebop from Sunrise Animation, is all Singaporean women money grabbing? Because the character depicted as money grabbing, bounty hunter. Okay, the story is about bounty hunters. But I said no, because we have different races here. Not all Singaporean ladies are depicted. But this cultural representation does not lie with United States itself or even the West. The Japanese they have. So I think with this, we had to look at a bigger context, how the Japanese see Singapore, how Hong Kong sees Singapore, or even how Taiwan sees Singapore. It's very interesting. But to cut it short, that we need to actually draw the line between entertainment and then cultural representation. It's a good thing that we talk about it. We don't talk about it in the 90s, where we see the big screen. Oh, Armageddon in Singapore got destroyed. Oh, okay, that's it. That's entertainment. But I think nowadays we have people actually start to look at it already, and we have to think: are we going to tell the studios to say, can we have a bit of put Singapore in a bit of a good light, rather than feature the bad aspect of it? But this is up to individuals, the thinking of it. But I think the fundamental is that sometimes we need to draw the line. This is entertainment.
Sorry, Sean, I'm wondering if you have a question that you have in mind? Is it more of a
no, I think it's more of a comment. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks for sharing that. But I think it's very fascinating, this idea of you brought up this series of scenes where Singapore has been destroyed. I think that is a very interesting trope that existed at a certain time. So just when we were talking about Singapore being imagined, it has also been imagined as completely being destroyed, and now it's being reimagined in a different sort of way, where it's shimmering and shiny and bright. So thanks for that observation. Do we have any more questions? Do we have? Okay, sorry, we have some questions from online channels. Give me a second. We have a question from Jose Pereira. Two questions, actually. Let me just see. Okay. I'm interested in what Abby's son said about techno-orientalism perpetuated in many outside visions of Singapore. What are the panelists' thoughts on how much of this is a prescribed process or one that reflects much of Singapore's internal politics? So I guess, yeah, I mean, since Abby brought up the term techno-orientalism, I'm wondering if Abby wants to kind of start off.
Sure. Thank you, Jose. I'm not sure if I can comment on maybe Singaporean politics, because unlike Keisha, I've never been to Singapore or anywhere in Southeast Asia. I've been to East Asia and Central Asia only. Yeah, I mean, this idea of techno-orientalism is something that's been used to critique science fiction. So I can actually build off of the prior comment about Cowboy Bebop. And all of that, I would agree this is not exclusive to Western depiction. So I did say that. in my earlier comment. I do think that a lot of Japanese manga and anime depictions could be argued and have been argued by scholars to also fit within this mold, because the kind of features of people in the films aren't necessarily visibly recognizable as kind of stereotypical Asian features. But yeah, I mean, for me, what techno-orientalism is in terms of this idea of representation is one way of kind of taking place in a specific place and of indicating it's been kind of critiqued as drawn from this idea of yellow peril, that Asia is the future and it's going to completely take over the West, right? But in kind of depicting that it's a future that is represented by very visibly Asian symbols and signposts, but devoid of Asian people. So it is exactly kind of the critique of Crazy Rich Asians. It's like, you know, taking on the landscapes of Singapore, like Singaporean landmarks and all of that, but kind of devoid of anything that a Singaporean might recognize as feeling Singaporean. Yeah, maybe I'll stop there. There's a lot of other kind of interesting things that stem from this critiques, because for instance, within Black film and Black art in the US and in Europe, there's this idea of Afrofuturism, and there's this rising kind of inquiry within Asian American and Asian European culture and arts, asking why there isn't an Asian futurism that is apart from techno-orientalism. And that's a question that's kind of interested us a lot. You might have noticed we don't have any science fiction in our series. This is because we have been quite uneasy with the ways that Asian American filmmakers have adapted visions of Asian America or Asian futurisms to film. We feel that, or at least I feel that a lot of it draws from techno-orientalist kind of tropes. And this would include films like After Yang, which was at Cannes last year.
Thanks, Abby. I'm wondering if anyone in the panel want to comment on Jose's question. I guess it's this tension between how much of this techno-orientalism is prescribed from a sort of top-down way, and how much does it actually reflect aspirations, or what Jose has put it as Singapore's internal politics, which I'm also assuming it's got to do with our own visions of how we see ourselves. I'm wondering if Freddie, you want to comment a bit on that.
And I don't profess to like completely.
I guess to put it in a bit more context is also that, you know, I guess productions such as Westworld would have happened in Singapore due to, you know, there are several, you know, grants and you know, schemes that one can apply to film in Singapore that make it easier. But also that allows for that vision of Singapore to happen.
But let me be quite clear. I think the funding policy in Singapore doesn't influence from the creative perspective in terms of the narrative. And you can't ever, the US guys will not even take your funds. If they are creative, it's going to be compromised in that sense. So I think it's quite clear. But, you know, if you look at Westworld and you look at even Agent 47, where the baddies were meant to be based in Singapore, actually, you know, and Westworld as well, Sirac and things like that, you know, its headquarters here in Singapore, so-called in that sense. It does maybe create and lend that, you know, that kind of yeah, you might be pristine and polished, but you know, all is not well, you know, you're soulless, you know, in that sense. And but it just adds to that narrative that maybe Singapore, you know, has obviously been created on the surface, right? I think just going back to Preeti about talking about the foreign workers, I think that was there. I mean, just from a personal level, it debunked everything that we position ourselves to be as a country. When that happened and the documentaries and all that came out, the commentary that came out, suddenly it was, oh gosh, it just laid further proof that we were, or at least from a positioning perspective, we were very superficial and we didn't worry about really the soul of the place, the underbelly of the place that started to maybe show us up. You know what I mean? Crazy Rich Asians certainly didn't have that, right? Westworld was completely a commentary on something else external, but that's real life, huh? So you know, I think that was, to me, you know, further fodder for people who are writing stories. If Singapore was involved, who might want to kind of portray a little bit of that exterior, you know, polished image that we've got. But actually, deep down, we've got some work to do and some big realization to actually realize that we need to be better, you know. And somehow through the narrative, you know, I think a lot of our filmmakers from Singapore would start generating a lot of those kinds of inspirations in their stories. And I wanted to also say a point about the concept of making made in Singapore versus a made by and made with Singapore. I think it's huge. It changes everything. We don't think about us as a country on its own, telling our own stories, but, you know, in the perspective of us being part of a bigger region and things like that, and working with different people around the region particularly, the made with and made by suddenly changes a lot of things. Ajuma, I mean, as a classic example, a Singapore perspective of something happening in Korea, it's a very fresh perspective in that sense. It doesn't happen in Singapore. But it also gives very nice touch points about how we perceive certain things and things like that. And, you know, sorry, I'm going, again, out of point probably. I'll fail, you know, like, you know, if I, you know, that's why I never got a, like a...
No, I think Freddie, I think you brought up a few, you know, I think
I-
two things I'd like to, yes, sorry.
Sorry, could I actually ask a question of you,
Yeah.
Freddie? Apologies, I know I'm like behind you. But you had mentioned, I think you bring up a really great point, and you had mentioned that, you know, just being involved in commercial endeavors doesn't mean that you don't support independent filmmaking. And now you're pointing out this difference of films made, you know, in versus with and a by. I'm curious how you're thinking about maybe reinvesting the money that you get from these productions into maybe supporting films made with and by Singaporean, because that to me is kind of a key mechanism. We can sort of reinvest, right, or subsidize, or, you know, take from the rich and give to the poor. I'm curious your thoughts on that.
You see, I would be in the best position to tell you if my films make money, but my films don't. See, I mean, when we talk about commercial films, supporting films, those are all service films, so service fees and things like that. You don't kind of make money for that. But for your own independent films, if you release it and because you own the IP exploitation, I'm still waiting for that golden goose to happen. But bottom line for me is this: I think, and this is how we started. And just to give a bit of a throwback, in the early days, when I say early days, maybe in the 90s, mid 90s, 97, around that time. So we started as a post-production facility, and we had enough people and a lot of equipment. And at that time, the entry barrier for post-production was really high. Everything was proprietary, there was no open concepts and things like that. Our short filmmakers and our filmmakers were submitting their projects to international festivals. And I tell you, from a quality perspective, we were nowhere compared with what the submissions of the rest of the world were, because they were a bit more mature. There was proper funding bodies and things like that. We were very young. As a post-production facility, we just said, we went, and I've helped a lot of the young filmmakers who they are today, you know, when they had their short films and things like that, to say, look, come in, work, but take the night shift, because I'm 24 hours, but I don't have enough work for 24 hours, but I want my editors, I want my colorists to be able to work with you and grow together in supporting your short films, because they don't have any money, which means that we would do it for free, but at least you end up with a product that's of a certain level of quality that's able to compete with the contemporaries from more matured filmmaking places. So just going back to your point, Abby, about what I see about independent filmmaking, I think bottom line is that we have so many talent and stories that they want to tell, but they don't have sometimes the right resources to be able to back them up, to be able to do the work, right? And I think as a collective, the industry, and a few of us do keep our eyes open on who is the next person, whether it was the Junfengs of the world or whether it was Royston and all that kind of stuff, where they came through that route. I think we were always going to be very conscious of the fact that we had a role to play. I don't want to give away my age, but we reach a certain age where I think it is almost a responsibility for us, the more sort of the people who have been in the industry, to look out for the younger filmmakers and be able to support them in their endeavors, whether it's through production, through post-production, through contacts, through networking, film festivals, and just talking to programmers about an upcoming filmmaker, you got to watch his film and things like that. I think as an industry, it's a very important role for us to play, to do that, So Abby, I think from my perspective, while we choose and chase that golden goose, I think bottom line, where we are here in Singapore, this is also our lifeline, and we cannot not ignore, the talent that exists, and we got to try and help as much as we can.
Thank you. I think we've kind of come to I don't think we have any time for any more questions. I think we've talked quite a bit about what we the topics we wanted to go into. We've gone into several diversions, and there's I feel this topic can even have a part 2 because there's so much to excavate here. But I'd like to thank everyone for joining us here, joining us online. I'd like to thank our guests, Keng Hua, Leon, Preeti, Freddie, Abby, and Keisha. And the Constellating Histories program is going to be going on until the middle of March. Do check out our website for more details. We, of course, have screenings here every single week on Wednesdays, Fridays, Saturdays, and Sundays. Do join us for many of these films, and we have several other exciting programs lined up for the rest of the year. And yeah, thank you. Have a great day ahead. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody.